Hey everyone, welcome back to another version of Security Shorts with Scott. Super fascinating conversation today. For those who don't know, we've recently launched a CMMC security program service, and we are talking with Fernando Machado. He's the managing principal and CISO at CyberSec Investments, and candidly, one of the most engaging, clear, and articulate people I've ever run into when it comes to CMMC and how that impacts organizations, both from an architectural standpoint, whether or not it's FedRAMP or GCC type environments, or from a current government rules and regulations. So with that, Fernando, super happy to have you on the podcast. Thank you for joining Security Shorts with Scott.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We always like to start with a story, a short story, or a humorous example of like, how did you get into what you do for a living? So maybe talk a little bit about how did you get into becoming a CMMC expert when that's not something that most people are super knowledgeable about.
So I've been in the cybersecurity field, particularly in the DoD field, for nearly 15 years. Before I got into CMMC, I started listening in on like what was happening in Congress on the different issues that the defense industrial base was having. And then in fiscal year 2020, when the NDAA was passed requiring a third-party certification that ended up leading the CMMC program, I reached out to one of the board members, and I was fortunate enough to join one of the standards management industry working groups. And our job was to develop the assessment criteria for the CMMC program. Our group contributed something crazy like 17,000 volunteer hours doing that. And we ended up being formally recognized by the President of the United States with the President's Volunteer Service Award. Then later that year in 2020, when the CMMC program started the provisional assessor program, the first 5 provisional assessors were reserved at the time for the board members. I was number 8. So I've been involved in the CMMC space for coming up on 4 years now.
You are an OG, as they say, in this space.
Yep.
That's awesome. So Fernando, I'm going to roll 2 or 3 questions in here and then we can sort of pick them apart. But when I go out and talk to folks, we get asked all the time, they're like, well, we know that CMMC is coming, but we don't really have to do something about it now. And we're not really sure if we're going to need to be compliant anyway in the future. So maybe start by unpacking just a little bit about like, where does CMMC apply? Right? Who's going to sort of be under the auspice? Oh, that's the other thing we get. Well, I'm not Lockheed Martin, so why do I need to worry about CMMC? Right? So where does it apply? Who's it impacting? And how does that sort of fit inside of people need to start thinking about getting ready once they understand that they probably will be impacted?
Right. So the first thing that I would like to tell people is that CMMC at the moment is a DoD program. And all CMMC is, it is a third-party validation mechanism of your existing DFAR 7012 requirements. And I think that a lot of the hoopla and the misunderstanding that they think that CMMC is a new set of requirements that's coming down. What we're waiting for, theoretically, is what we're waiting for the government to do is we're waiting for that third-party validation program to kick into existence. But if you read the CMMC assessment guide and you read the NIST 800-171A assessment guide, they're literally exactly the same. And so all CMMC is a third-party validation program of your existing DFAR 7012 requirements.
Gotcha. And so when I started getting into this a lot more, what I came to realize was, as you said, there's a lot of stuff that actually should be being done already. So when it comes to DFAR 7012, that is something that people are submitting in order to win bids with the government, right? So when we talk about the DIB or the defense industrial base, these are a set of people that are saying, I can provide a good or service to the government. And so in there's an attestation, a self-attestation saying that they're meeting a certain set of requirements, essentially aligned to NIST 800-171. So is that the connection that people seem to be missing? Is that technically you're probably supposed to be doing something like that now anyway?
Right. So a little brief history. So back in 2019, the DoD Inspector General report went out there and they did an inspection on contractors in the defense industrial base that were handling UI. And the 2 criteria that they were using was one, that the contractors had at least $1 million in contract award, and two, that they were actively handling CUI. And what they found was that all 9 contractors that they had selected had all failed the assessment. They started to realize that all the contractors were attesting that they were doing these things, but in reality, they weren't doing anything. And so later that year, as you could see the progression, and fiscal year 2020, which would have been December of 2019, that's why the CMMC program began to add that third-party verification mechanism of your existing DFAR 7012 requirements, one of which is the implementation of NIST 800-171.
Perfect. That's a really excellent way of describing this and sort of deconstructing, because I do think people get confused about the readiness and what needs to happen. So another level of confusion that I hear out there all the time is obviously people are uncertain about CMMC and the applicability. I think you've done a great job of explaining that. Then they come into FedRAMP or GovCloud, and they're like, well, do I have to or do I not have to? Maybe take a minute and talk about why GovCloud FedRAMP is there, and then how we're going to see that integration with CMMC, because they're two separate things, but they bump into each other, as you know.
Right. So one of the biggest things that folks need to understand is the FedRAMP requirements that are outlined in DFAR 7012 says that if you as a contractor are going to use a cloud service provider to process, store, or transmit any CUI, then you have to require and ensure that that cloud service provider is at least FedRAMP moderate or equivalent and is complying with paragraph C through G. And so where a lot of folks don't understand, this is one of the biggest pitfalls that they make, is they believe that Microsoft 365 Commercial is a compliant environment, and it is not. So Microsoft 365 Commercial, although it's in FedRAMP High, which exceeds the FedRAMP moderate requirements, Microsoft has stated they will not accept the paragraph C through G flow down. That's why it makes it a non-compliant environment. And so a step up from that, from Microsoft's offering, would be the GCC environment, where this is in FedRAMP High, and as well as they comply with the paragraph C through G clause. And so starting from that point forward, from the GCC environment forward, as far as Microsoft is concerned, that's a compliant environment.
And I think that really gets to the heart of it, because when people are wondering why we built our CMMC solution in GovCloud GCC instantiations, and it's because they go together, and people don't oftentimes understand that there's the technical delivery components that flow into the set of regulatory components, if you will, and how those two get matched up. Okay, so that brings to one other, which I think you just hit, but people get confused about FedRAMP High versus FedRAMP Mediate versus CMMC, or FedRAMP Moderate. So maybe just take 30 seconds to just talk about, if you're in the DIB and you know CMMC is coming, you're probably going to have to get to FedRAMP Moderate across your cloud-based solutions, correct?
If you are going to be using a cloud service provider to process, store, or transmit CUI, then yes, this is something that can actually be, another option, when we start getting into architecture, this is something that maybe you want to host yourself, or if you want to use your cloud service provider to do that. And one of the things when it comes to CMMC is, it's not as simple as I'm going to go purchase a GCC High or GCC High license, The configurations have to be made, and there's a shared responsibility. You as a contractor have a certain set of responsibilities that you have to do, as well as what the cloud service provider has to do as well.
Yep. Yeah, and part of the reason why people look at us is because of that shared responsibility and the flow down components and the attestations, obviously.
Correct.
So, okay, so that's an awesome background. Maybe let's move a little bit into the reality, right? We hear it all the time. I'm thinking about getting a readiness assessment. So just to be super clear to everybody listening, there is no CMMC attestation yet because the government hasn't enforced it. What you can do is you can go get a readiness assessment, which is exactly what it sounds like. How ready are you to meet the CMMC 2.0 rule sets? But what are you seeing out there? Our view, and you can disabuse me of this notion, but our view is that 2024 is going to be the year that people really have to get serious about this. Is that what you're seeing, or are people going to be like, nope, I really am going to wait as long as humanly possible?
Well, earlier this year, I think the DoD was at an event and they asked them about, where CMMC was. For those that aren't aware, I'll kind of get you caught up as to like where the rule's at. So the rule was sent over from DoD to the Office of Management and Budget. So these are the regulators on July 24th. Then OMB has 90 days to review the rule, which would have put it at October 22nd. And then they can extend for an additional 30-day time period to continue to keep reviewing the rule. Now, if you're doing math, that puts it about Tuesday of next week. So does that mean that the CMMC rule is going to come out Tuesday of next week? No one knows. There could be delays. This is everything that we're waiting for. But when the rule does come out, the DoD has stated at that event that they were at is that their intent is for the CMMC language to put into contracts in fall of next year. So
it's coming.
That's the part that we're currently waiting for right now. But one of the things that I want to caution folks on is that even though CMMC is going to be put in the contracts to fall of next year, that does not stop your prime contractor for requiring you to go out and get assessed immediately, because that's a business to business relationship versus you waiting for the contract to come down towards you. So I caution you not to wait, because that is something that a lot of the prime contractors that I've had discussions with, that is their intent, to start making sure that their supply chain is in order.
That is a great point. And again, I get it. We're all super busy, and everybody out there is super busy. And so this whole concept of like dotting your I's and crossing your T's when it comes to this stuff is challenging. But we do know that supply chain risk, as we call it as a general term, you see it coming everywhere. Big banks down to their suppliers. Obviously, it makes sense for large primes to do the same. So let's talk about helping people. There's a rumor, let's play conspiracy hat theorist for a second. There's a rumor that the government's going to help sort of smaller DIB providers maybe cover some of the costs. I've seen nothing that says one way or the other. What is Fernando's personal prognostication on whether or not the government's going to help here?
I haven't seen anything like that either.
Yeah.
I know that in the past, especially if you read the DFARS interim rules that came out back in 2020, when you read those rules, there's a section in there that states that that rule, that's the specific DFARS interim rules, that costs associated with that rule do not include costs associated with things like DFARS 7012 or NIST 800-171, because in the government's views, contractors should have already incurred those costs, and therefore it's not attributed to this rule. So I think that if I were to go based off of that, I personally don't believe that the government is going to be helping out anyone. They may. I have no idea what's in the rule to come, but I haven't seen anything that makes me believe otherwise.
It's tough to say. I've been checking that compliance box on my DFAR for 5 years, but now I need money to go actually solve the problem.
Yep.
Awesome. All right, Fernando. We really appreciate the time. Are there any other recommendations for? We're not talking about Lockheed Martin here, but for the people smaller than Lockheed Martin, any other recommendations you want to make to them about how to help get them going? Obviously, we do a lot of work. SolCyber does a lot of work in the mid-market. You guys do. What's out there for them to help so that they don't feel like this is like just a train coming at them, and they can start getting ahead of it?
Yeah. So one of the biggest things is that when you're looking at GRC tools to kind of help you assess your internal compliance and kind of see like where you're at doing your own internal assessment, the biggest key is making sure that you are assessing yourself in accordance with NIST 800-171A. And a lot of folks don't realize that. There's a running joke that probably the majority of the scores in SPRS are probably incorrect, because folks, what they end up doing is they go straight to the DoD assessment methodology. They go straight down to the assessment scoring table and they start scoring themselves. Well, that scoring table is at the control level versus the assessment objective level. So simply put, that is the difference between the 110 controls that we hear, but you really have 320 separate assessment requirements that you have to meet. So that is first and foremost, get that taken care of. And number two, the sooner you start, the less expensive it's going to be, because this is a 12 to 18 month journey if you haven't done anything. And the longer you wait, when the CMMC rule kicks off and everybody's going and looking for help, contrary to popular belief, good cybersecurity professionals do not grow on trees, and their calendars are going to get booked up very fast. So the sooner you can get started, the better. And, you get to save money in the long run that way.
That last point is so important, everyone. Like, get ahead of this. There are actually relatively few certified assessors. The C3PO program is not where it's going to need to be. And so there's going to be a mad rush to get a hold of the few resources. That's besides the actual implementation of the cybersecurity people, the actual process. And so it's going to be difficult if you wait until the last minute. Fernando, how can our fine folks listening to this reach you?
Yeah, so you can reach us by email at info@cybersecinvestments.com, by phone, 800-960-8802, and you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm sure, there's a bunch of Fernando Machados out there, but I think you'll be able to find me, especially in the space. We're in the Melbourne area, so that'll kind of help narrow the search a little bit. Awesome.
Fernando, super great job on this. It's a complicated topic. Really appreciate you breaking it down into easy to understand components. Really appreciate the time, and thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a great podcast.